New York City, November 28, 1953. It is 2:30 in the morning. The Statler Hotel stands quiet on 7th Avenue. Most of the city is asleep. On the 10th floor, in room 1018A, a man named Frank Olson is wide awake. He has barely slept in 10 days. He has barely eaten. He has told colleagues he wants to quit his job, that he has made a terrible mistake. He has been seen weeping in corridors. He has told his CIA-connected psychiatrist that he feels he is being followed. Frank Olson is 43 years old. He is a husband, a father of 3, a distinguished biochemist who works for the United States Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland. By all accounts, he is a gentle, intelligent, deeply private man. At 2:30 a.m., something happens in room 1018A. Frank Olson goes through the window, 10 floors, straight down to the pavement of 7th Avenue. The official verdict? Suicide. His wife Ruth is told that Frank jumped. She accepts it, devastated, and spends the next 20 years quietly raising their children alone. And that would have been the end of Frank Olson's story. A tragic footnote, a private family grief, a closed case in a government filing cabinet. Except that 22 years later, in 1975, a government report on CIA abuses quietly mentioned, almost in passing, that an unnamed Army scientist had died after being secretly dosed with LSD by the CIA without his knowledge or consent. Frank Olson's son, Eric, read that report, and he recognized his father. To understand MKUltra, you have to understand the specific terror that gripped Washington in the early 1950s. World War II had ended. The Soviet Union had the atomic bomb. China had fallen to communism. And in Korea, American soldiers were fighting and losing, a war that felt like it had no end. But the thing that truly frightened American intelligence officials was not the bombs, and it was not the armies. It was the prisoners. When American POWs began appearing in televised North Korean press conferences, something was deeply wrong. These were U.S. military men, trained, disciplined, loyal soldiers. And they were calmly denouncing America, confessing to war crimes they almost certainly had not committed, praising communism, renouncing their country. The term that swept through Washington was brainwashing. It had been coined just a few years earlier, and it described something that seemed almost supernatural. The ability to reach inside a man's mind and rewrite his beliefs, his loyalties, his very identity. American intelligence officials were convinced, absolutely convinced, that the Soviets and the Chinese had cracked the code of the human mind, that they had developed techniques to break any man, to make him say anything, believe anything, do anything, and America had nothing to counter it. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles, one of the most powerful men in Washington, stood before a group of Princeton alumni and delivered a chilling warning about what he called the battle for men's minds. He spoke of a sinister Soviet program to gain control of human behavior. What Dulles did not mention, what he could not mention, was that on that same day, he had signed off on a CIA program to do exactly the same thing. Not to Soviet citizens, to Americans. The program was given the code name MKUltra. MK stood for the CIA's Technical Services Division. Ultra was borrowed from the World War II code-breaking operation, a word that meant the highest level of secrecy imaginable. Its mandate was simple and terrifying: explore every possible method of controlling human behavior: drugs, hypnosis, electroshock, sensory deprivation, psychological torture, radiation, surgery, whatever it took, and it would operate in complete secrecy. No oversight, no accountability, no records. The man Dulles chose to run it was a 35-year-old chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. He would become the most dangerous man in America that nobody had ever heard of. If you were asked to imagine the man behind America's most criminal secret program, you would probably picture someone cold, remote, bureaucratic. A man in a gray suit behind a gray desk. Sidney Gottlieb was nothing like that. He had a PhD in chemistry from Caltech. He had a clubfoot that gave him a pronounced limp. He had a stutter that he had spent years learning to control. He grew Christmas trees on a farm in rural Virginia. He loved folk dancing. He drank only goat's milk, which he produced himself. He was also, by any reasonable measure, a monster. Gottlieb joined the CIA in 1951 and rose quickly through the technical services staff. He had already developed a dart gun that could fire a frozen dart of shellfish toxin. So thin it left no mark, so lethal a single scratch was fatal. When Alan Dulles handed him MKUltra, Gottlieb approached it with the energy and creativity of a man who had found his life's purpose. He set up a network of over 150 research projects, which the CIA called sub-projects, spread across 80 institutions in the United States and Canada. Universities, hospitals, prisons, mental institutions, research foundations. Most of these institutions had no idea they were working for the CIA. The funding was funneled through fake philanthropic foundations. Respected academics received CIA money without knowing its source, conducting research that fed directly into MKUltra's goals. And some of them, when they realized what they were part of, kept going anyway. The early focus was on drugs, specifically on a chemical that had been discovered in a Swiss laboratory in 1943 by a scientist named Albert Hofmann, who accidentally ingested a tiny amount and spent the afternoon experiencing vivid hallucinations. He described it as an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures. The drug was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. The CIA became fascinated with LSD almost immediately after learning of its existence. At almost unimaginably small doses, it could completely dissolve a person's sense of reality. It produced extreme suggestibility. It could make a man talk. It could make a man crack, or so Gottlieb believed. The word unwitting appears throughout MKUltra's documents. It is a careful, bureaucratic word. A word chosen specifically to avoid saying what it actually means, that American citizens were experimented on without their knowledge, without their consent, and without any possibility of protecting themselves. The experiments began in hospitals and universities, but the CIA quickly decided that academic researchers were too cautious, too bound by ethics, too unwilling to push subjects to their breaking point. So they turned to people who had no power to refuse: prisoners, mental patients, drug addicts, people who were already locked inside institutions, already at the mercy of the state, already stripped of their autonomy. At the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, CIA-funded researchers gave LSD to patients, many of them black men, for periods of up to 77 consecutive days. 77 days of continuous LSD, not for therapeutic purposes, to see what happened. At psychiatric hospitals across the country, patients were dosed with LSD, mescaline, heroin, and combinations of drugs, then subjected to sleep deprivation, isolation, and psychological pressure, all in the name of research that the CIA was funding from the shadows. What is perhaps most disturbing is the range of people swept into MKUltra's orbit. Whitey Bulger, who would later become one of the most feared mob bosses in American history, was a young prisoner in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1957. He volunteered for what he was told was a cancer study. For the next 18 months, he was given LSD regularly. He later said it gave him nightmares for the rest of his life. Theodore Kaczynski, a mathematics prodigy who entered Harvard at the age of 16, participated in a psychological study run by Henry Murray. Murray's study involved subjecting participants to brutal, sustained psychological attack. Their most deeply held beliefs were systematically humiliated. Their identities were stripped apart. Kaczynski participated for 3 years. He later became the Unabomber, whose manifesto obsessively targeted technology and the systems of control he believed had dehumanized mankind. No one disputes that a teenage prodigy walked into Harvard and was repeatedly psychologically tortured by CIA-funded researchers, and that he was never told the truth. These were not fringe cases. They were not aberrations. They were the program. And in San Francisco, the CIA was about to take MKUltra somewhere that even its own internal critics would later describe as completely out of control. George Hunter White was not a subtle man. He was a former narcotics agent, heavy-set, hard-drinking, foul-mouthed, and completely without shame. He had worked undercover for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics for years, and he was exactly the kind of man Sidney Gottlieb was looking for. In 1955, Gottlieb gave White a budget, a cover story, and a mission: set up a safe house in San Francisco and find out what LSD did to ordinary, unsuspecting people. Real people. People off the street. People who had no idea what was about to happen to them. White rented an apartment at 225 Chestnut Street in San Francisco's Telegraph Hill neighborhood. He decorated it to look like a bohemian pad, reproductions of French posters, a bar fully stocked with liquor, black velvet drapes. Behind the drapes were one-way mirrors. Behind the mirrors were CIA observers with cameras and recording equipment. White hired sex workers, paying them with government money, to bring men back to the apartment. Once inside, the men were served drinks laced with LSD without their knowledge. White and his colleagues then watched through the one-way mirrors. The operation was called Midnight Climax. It ran for 10 years, from 1955 to 1965, first in San Francisco, then in New York City. The men who were dosed had no recourse. They had no idea they were part of a CIA experiment. They could not report what had been done to them. They simply went home, confused, disoriented, frightened by experiences they could not explain, and carried what had happened to them in silence. George White, by this time, had become something that no government oversight body knew existed, a CIA employee who was running illegal drug experiments. He later wrote in a letter to Sidney Gottlieb, "I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun." Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? That letter survived. But Operation Midnight Climax, as extreme as it was not the darkest chapter of MKUltra. For that, you have to go to Canada, to a hospital in Montreal, to a man named Ewen Cameron, who believed he had found a way to erase the human mind and rebuild it from scratch, and who spent 15 years doing exactly that. By any measure, Ewen Cameron was one of the most distinguished psychiatrists in the world. He was Scottish-born, trained at the finest institutions. He was the founding president of the World Psychiatric Association. He chaired the Department of Psychiatry at McGill. He was also conducting experiments on his patients that were among the most grotesque violations of medical ethics in recorded history. Cameron believed, with complete sincerity, that mental illness could be cured by erasing a patient's existing personality and rebuilding a healthier one from scratch. He called the process depatterning, and he pursued it with the resources of both McGill University and, through a series of CIA front organizations, the United States government. His patients came to him seeking help. They arrived at the Allen Memorial Institute suffering from depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. None of them had consented. The depatterning process began with drugs. Patients were put into artificially induced sleep using combinations of sedatives and kept there, not for a day, for weeks, sometimes months. Cameron would keep patients asleep for up to 86 days at a time, waking them only briefly for basic functions. While they slept, he subjected them to electroconvulsive therapy at intensities between 30 and 40 times the normal level. His colleagues who knew about it were horrified. And then, once the mind had been depatterned, he would begin the process he called psychic driving. Speakers were placed under patients' pillows. Recorded messages, sometimes the patient's own voice, sometimes Cameron's, were played on a loop for hours, then days, then hundreds of thousands of repetitions. The goal was to implant new beliefs, new behavioral patterns, into the blank slate of a depatterned mind. What Cameron actually produced was devastation. Patients left the Allen Memorial Institute unable to remember their names, unable to remember their families, unable to perform basic tasks like dressing themselves. One patient, a young woman named Linda McDonald, arrived in 1963 suffering from mild depression. She left unable to remember her husband or her 5 children. She had to be retaught how to cook, how to drive, how to function as an adult. She was 26 years old. Cameron died in 1967, never having been charged with any crime. The Canadian government paid 77 of his victims $100,000 each. The CIA, which had funded him throughout, paid nothing. The man who built MKUltra made a decision to bury its crimes forever. Richard Helms had been CIA director since 1966. He was a career intelligence officer, precise, controlled, intensely loyal to the agency. In December 1972, knowing that he was about to be replaced as director, Helms made a decision. He ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. It was not a suggestion, it was a direct order to Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb spent the final days of his CIA career supervising the shredding and burning of 20 years of MKUltra documentation. Files, reports, photographs, experimental records, the identities of subjects, the details of sub-projects, all of it. What it meant was, he destroyed the evidence. By January 1973, MKUltra was, as far as the CIA was concerned, gone. An operation without a paper trail, a crime without a record. And then, Frank Olson's name appeared in the Rockefeller Commission report in 1975. The Rockefeller Commission had been established by President Ford. Its investigators found enough fragments, enough surviving references in documents that had escaped Helms's destruction order, to note that a scientist had died. Frank Olson's family came forward. The Ford administration paid them $750,000 in a quiet settlement. President Ford personally apologized to the family, and suddenly, the questions would not stop. Senator Frank Church established a Senate Select Committee to investigate intelligence abuses. Church's investigators found surviving traces of MKUltra. What they found horrified them, but without the primary files, they could not see the full picture. Then, in 1977, a CIA historian responding to a Freedom of Information Act request made a discovery that changed everything. In a record storage facility in Warrenton, Virginia, misfiled under financial records and therefore overlooked by Gottlieb's shredding teams, were over 20,000 pages of MKUltra documents. The documents went to journalist John Marks, who spent years analyzing them and published a landmark book. They went to Senate investigators, who called new hearings in 1977. CIA Director Stansfield Turner sat before the Senate and confirmed what the documents showed. But here is what happened to the people responsible. Richard Helms was convicted in 1977, not for MKUltra, but for lying to Congress. He received a 2-year suspended sentence and a $2,000 fine. He called the conviction a badge of honor. Sidney Gottlieb retired to his Virginia farm, tended his goats, and died in 1999. He was never charged. No CIA officer was ever imprisoned for what was done to American citizens over 20 years. Not one.